Alan Moore is the creator of Watchmen and other graphic novels that are cultural landmarks, shall we say. He's also the author of Jerusalem. He's now writing a new series of novels. The first was called The Great When. The novels are the Long London Quintet, and his new novel is I Hear a New World Coming. Thank you for joining me, Alan.
Well, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm just currently at the very, very end of the third book, which I should probably be finishing tonight or tomorrow. But it's nice to get a chance to remind myself what I was doing with the second book.
Well, I, to be honest, let me tell you, I went back and reread the first book just before I started the second book and proved an old truism to be, in fact, true, which is a man can't cross the same river twice, which is to say that you he's not the same man, it's not the same river. A man cannot read a great novel, the same great novel twice because I wasn't the same man and it was no longer the same novel. I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about conjuring up words that can be read twice and taken in completely different ways. I found it to be really a fascinating experience.
Well, I've always liked to give my readers a bit of a neurological workout. Ever since my earliest works, if I could find a way to put more layers in, then I would do. Um, I think that this probably all goes back to when I was maybe 13 or 14, and I was watching Patrick McGowan's excellent series, The Prisoner. And I remember that there was one particular episode where the little butler, played by I think Angela Muscat, um, at the end of it, after number six has tried to escape from the village but has failed, you get the butler bringing on a silver tray this tiny pawn and replacing it on the chessboard. And I suddenly understood symbolism for the first time. And that has served me very well since then. I've There are so many ways that you can load a sentence, a chapter, a novel, that you can instill so much information in there in coded form, that hopefully the readers, as they grow up and pass through life, will be able to reinvestigate it and still find something there. I know that with my favourite books, that has always been the case. I read Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy. I read it as I think a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, and I've been reading it again recently to my grandchildren as a bedtime story. Yeah, they are probably going to grow up traumatized, but sort of that's the way that things go. But uh, but I've discovered it. Yeah, I'm reading it again, and I'm realizing all these things about Peake's writing style, all the things that I didn't appreciate when I was 13. And I'm realizing how much my own lurid writing style is. Mervyn Peake, I think, can be blamed for a lot of it. His incredible flights of fancy, where he'll take up a paragraph just with some nonsense that suddenly occurred to him. I love that. And I think that that has made a very deep impression on my own style.
Well, I have to say, bringing up Mervyn Peake, reading that at 12 or 13, which is about when I read it for the first time, and I've been rereading it many times since. You talked about the flights of fancy he goes on. There's one chapter in Glowing Guest I love, which is the reveries, where they're all sitting around the dinner table and you just get the thoughts of what each one is thinking. It is so beautiful. I have read that aloud many, many times. And I will confess that before I asked my wife to marry me, I gave her a knife, a freckled and frivolous knife based on Fuchsia's poem about the knife in the haddock. So
Yes.
I can really understand what you're talking about with laying in the layers, and it's done in these novels superbly well. And one of the things that strikes me about laying in layers and how much information you're allowed to communicate in both the Great When and I Hear a New World Coming, there's you begin with like trying to describe musical pieces in words, and I think you do a fabulous job of that. And that makes me think because one of the things I love about music is, I believe, the highest bandwidth means of communicating information that humans really have. In two notes of a saxophone, you can convey emotions and situations that words, pictures, nothing else can touch. And I think that in trying to emulate the musical beginnings of both of these novels and the allusions to music throughout, really speak to this idea of trying to say more than words can say.
Well, I think that it was one of the philosophers, and I can never remember which one. I'd sound much more intelligent if I could actually remember the people that I'm quoting. But one of the philosophers said that all art aspires to the condition of music. And I think that that is quite profound and probably true. Uh, I think that there is music is something that I pay a lot of attention to. I mean, yes, the bits at the beginning, the preludes. I mean, because what prelude actually means is the music at the beginning. So I've got those sections where I don't even know what it is. In the first book, it was classes of instrument. And so I'd got a section that to me suggested woodwind, another section that suggested strings, and so on. In the second book, it's types of music. So I've got classical and I've got calypso, rock and roll, skiffle, um, and I think in the third book it's Rolling Stones tracks. Um, but this is to give a sort of a musical sense to these opening pieces. But in the bulk of the novel as well, I just the way that my prose style has evolved. I have always, since first reading my poetry aloud as a teenager and realizing that things that look good on the printed page were rubbish when you actually tried to speak them in front of an audience because the syllables were wrong, the rhythm was wrong. And so I began to pay extreme attention to the rhythm of my prose, realizing that even if I wasn't reading it aloud, this would be the rhythm that the reader was recreating in his or her head. Um, so I try to pay attention to the music of language itself. I spend an awful lot of time just staring at the laptop and trying to think of a word that has three syllables with the right number of beats to the right shape to it and the right sort of texture and resonance, the right kind of poetry. This is why it takes me so long to write these things. It's but yeah, music is it's there in the back of every sentence that I write.
And it's also in the front end of this book. When I first saw the name Joe Meek, my jaw kind of dropped. Uh, Behind me, though you can't see it, I have tens of thousands of dollars of audio equipment that I've acquired over the past 45 years. Recording sounds, I started out plugging a cassette deck into the back of a Fender Twin Reverb amplifier. I graduated to the Marlboro Quadra Sound Blender, which was something one of my friends' parents had bought him from Sears to record his guitars, and now it's just all strings and wires. And I have a whole room that looks like a wall of Brazil has erupted into my.
Well, so you are somebody who appreciates Joe Meek then.
Absolutely. All these
Yeah.
years I'm still lusting after buying, one of these things he built. And it's coming vaguely into the orbit of, well, if I can put this money on my PayPal card and pay it back. But so
You're nearly there. That's dangerous. Yeah, but good luck. You know.
So tell us about Joe Meek because as I had heard about his equipment. I didn't know about the man, and it is so much fun to learn about the man, especially
Well,
as from your history, which I think you are a fabulous writer of history. So let's get back to Joe Meek.
okay. Well, Joe Meek. I first encountered the Joe Meek story when it was back in my very intense early magic days when I'd declared myself as a magician in 1993 and immediately embarked upon a number of magical performances over the next 4 or 5 years. Um, and it was at the third or fourth of these. I've forgotten the precise order, but the third or fourth of these, we'd been invited to perform at a club upstairs at the Garage in Highbury, which was quite a prominent venue at the time.
Nice.
Um, and so I decided that we'd do a site-specific recording that it would be something that would only be performed once on that night, in that place, and it would be relevant to the Highbury area. So I started to research Highbury and was initially disappointed because all of my usual things, famous ghosts, famous murders, I couldn't find any trace of them. So I had to dig a bit deeper. And then all of this incredibly rich information started to come to light. The Arsenal team of the early 20th century who had taken what their manager called courage pills to help them with a cup final. This was amphetamines, and it put them in such a state that the match ended in a draw because I think they were too paranoid to pass, and and all of these other fantastic things. Highbury Barn, where the conjoined twins Chang and Eng were exhibited, and there were can-can dancers and exhibitions of Pepper's Ghost, which was a sheet of angled glass that would create the illusion of transparent people on the stage. Um, and in amongst all this, I found Joe Meek, who had his studio about halfway, well, towards the top of the Holloway Road. Um, this was the studio where he had wires and cables all over the floor, but because he had this occult knowledge of which one to plug into which other one, he could get this incredible range of effects. And it was later when people thought, actually, if you got all of these cables off of the floor and put them into, I don't know, some sort of desk, then maybe you'd really have something. And this was the origin of the mixing desk. Joe Meek was holding things together with chewing gum. He was taking the spring of a garden gate and using it as an echo chamber. He was a complete sorcerer of sound, who had he had his problems. He'd grown up in Newent, which is right on the edge of the big dark Forest of Dean. and was quite a provincial place. And Joe was gay. Uh, from early childhood, he'd always been gay, which didn't go down well in a community like Newent. He was always an outsider, and couldn't wait to get away to London, where he could do things that wouldn't get back to Newent. Um, and he was pretty okay with that. And he did all of this wonderful stuff, and but he was obsessed with seances. He was obsessed with the occult. Um, and he carried out a couple of seances which were quite strange, which I've described in the book, including one where he got, with some automatic writing and some tarot cards, he got the message February the 3rd, Buddy Holly dies. Um, and actually, Buddy Holly did die on February the 3rd, but not that year. It was a year out, the prediction, which changed everything. But there were all these strange stories. Joe Meek said that he'd recorded a cat that had talked to him in Highgate Cemetery. I believe that recordings of it do still exist. Um, it perhaps doesn't sound the same to a modern listener as it did to Joe, who was taking quite a lot of Preludin to keep his weight down, and it was having the kind of effects that you might expect from a drug like that. Um, but all of these things, they seem to suggest something so incredible that I thought I would really like to use Joe as a character. And indeed, I think he was my favourite character in the second book. And strangely, strangely, while I was writing the second book, I got a letter through the post, which I sometimes do get, and sometimes they're a bit odd. And this one had got on the back a sticker of a cat, with drawn around it in biro very neatly a graveyard, and there was a balloon coming from the cat saying, "Hello, help me." And I thought, this doesn't look good. Um, I opened it up, and it was from a woman living in Northampton, and has been living here, I believe, since the well, probably 20 years or something. She's been here for a long time. Uh, whose name was Elena Duke, which didn't ring any bells at all. And she explained that she'd just read The Great When and was excited by the mentions of Joe Meek because she was the widow of somebody called Robbie Duke, which again didn't ring any bells. Um, Robbie Duke had formerly been Patrick Pink, at which point a lot of bells started ringing. I mean, Patrick Pink was Joe Meek's studio assistant and the last person to see Joe alive, literally. He was Joe Meek killed himself and his landlady while this poor 17-year-old kid was looking on. Um, and he had then taken the name Robbie Duke because that was he always hated his own name, which was Patrick Pink. And the name that Joe had always suggested that he should use for his own recording career was Robbie Duke. So he took on that name. He'd met Elena, and they'd been living on the Eastern District in Northampton. So um, I got a message from Elena the other day. We've become quite friends, and she's been telling me lots of things which I couldn't have got from anybody else, including she mentioned in one of her early letters that there was when her late husband, had been working with Joe in late 1966, early 1967. There had been a couple of other people who just did odd jobs around the studio. Um, One of them, although nobody could remember his surname. One of them was called Dennis. Um, so this is the kind of thing that I am gifted by in Long London. All of these things that actually, however delirious and mad the fantasy, they turn out to be kind of true. Joe Meek was an absolute pleasure to write. Once I'd got his um, kind of nearly a Gloucester accent, once I'd got that kind of West Country burr, and once I'd realised how difficult it would be a gay man in London in the 1960s with that accent. It wouldn't have been a problem for the Brian Epsteins of this world who were urbane and received English, but because they could be gay men in the music business and it wasn't a problem. But Joe Meek, he'd got this kind of West Country accent, which wouldn't have gone with a gay lifestyle in London at that time. And sort of once I'd got that, I suddenly had a key to his personality. I was reading out his dialogue as I was writing it and thinking, yeah, he'd say that, and he'd probably put "you rotten pig" in there because that was one of his favourite expressions. It's sort of in the third book, at the music at the beginning, which I said it's all Stones tracks, Stones singles. There is the final section is "Paint It Black," and that is Joe Meek's "Last Morning," seen through the eyes of Patrick Pink, with a great deal of help from Patrick Pink's widow, including she sent us a tape that was the tape of Patrick Robbie's own music that he was actually working on when Mrs. Shenton went upstairs to see what was the trouble with Joe. So yes, I think that in terms of my research on these books, I am pretty thoroughly backed up.
One of the things that occurred to me as I was reading, I Hear a New World Coming, was that you are an absolute ace historical novelist. And that, in spite of the gobs of wild-eyed, crazy, enjoyable fantasy, that fantasy actually serves to underscore the important points of the history that you're telling, and the way you weave out real characters in through this novel is just mind-boggling. It's also, when all said and done, pretty more educational than a course in British history because you use the elements of the fantastic to underscore what was really happening in history. And I think that is the perfect use of such gifts so that between the two of them, there's a kind of resonance like when you pluck two strings on a guitar, you get you have two different notes, two different strings, but they're reinforcing one another. And when you run it through an old cassette recorder, as I believe uh, the Stones guitars did, then you get something like satisfaction.
Mm. Yes, well, hopefully. I've I don't think that there's any point in writing fantasy that is just fantasy. I don't think that we need escapism in this modern world. I can see why everyone would want to escape it, but I think that we should probably not escape into actually unreal fantasy worlds when there is still such a lot of work to be done in this real one. So I like to use fantasy as a way of talking about the real world. And in the Long London Quintet, I think that what I'm doing is you're familiar with the process of grouting
Mhm.
when you're putting up your bathroom tiles, that you put this grout in between them. I think that I'm using fantasy as a kind of grouting to connect up
Exactly.
these isolated elements of reality, or reported historical reality. This really comes to the fore in the third book, but I'm doing it all the way through the whole series. It's just that in the 1960s, the news from the outside world was a bit torrential. It was coming every day. There was something astonishing or appalling every week. It was so I like to actually work all of this in to use fantasy to give it a context. It's a made up context, but it's got its own kind of truth. I
Exactly.
mean, it has a metaphorical truth at least
Well,
that
that's
sort of,
the
yeah,
that goes with music too, in that music conveys this information to us that isn't really, you can't, when you hear like a great sax solo or a wonderful string section coming in, mixing with the vocal, there's something that happens in your heart and in your mind between those two that can't really be expressed in words, images, or any other thing. It changes who you are or the way you see things or both. And
yeah,
I think that the way you're talking about using the elements that are fantastic to emphasize history is exactly correct. And again, this another genre for this story might be called the secret history, which is there's the history that's written down, and then there's the history that, each of us lives individually that weaves together in ways that, as you suggest with your experience with Joe Meek and finding out all this information, is, authentically magical, if not supernatural.
yeah, yeah. I find that there are all of these, the way that I experience the passage of my life, um, I'm completely open to those parts of it which are, to a degree, beyond my understanding. Things that have happened that are strange. I am not necessarily going to attribute a definite meaning or pattern to these things, but I acknowledge them. They're part of the fabric of my life, and I think that the odd events in history are part of the fabric of history, and history wouldn't be the same without them. And the reason that I've chosen my real world characters in the Long London books is precisely because these were people that seemed to me to have fallen down the paving cracks of London history. People like Austin Osman Spare, Prince Monolulu, Ironfoot Jack, Joe Meek, David Litvinov, all of these people. It struck me that sort of, if you could rescue these people from obscurity and let them tell a different kind of history that was no less true than the history that we have been served up with. Um, the thing is that interweaving history and fantasy, it's not that difficult because actually, if you think about it, history is a fantasy. Um, it's halfway there already.
It's a story we tell ourselves. And as with every memory, every time you dredge it up, it comes up differently, and you fabricate new things to make it work, fit a little bit better into the story that you want to tell.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I loved about this book was just the your sense of humor is fantastic, and I think it's really important.
Thank you.
It's important to I was laughing through a lot of this book, and it has to do with the language. So talk about using language. I mean, I cannot imagine that you just point your fingers at the word processor and or maybe it's true. Do you point your fingers at the word processor keyboard and words just appear on the page? Is it perfect when it comes out, or is it the product? Uh,
What I do is, for one thing, you're using the word finger in the plural there. I have, for most of my life, I've been a two-fingered typist, a very quick two-fingered typist, but in recent years, I have degenerated to a one-fingered typist. But what I do is my actual work processes at the moment. I try to do and achieve 500 words a day, which doesn't sound a lot, but my processes are with a word processor. I can write a sentence, and then I can adjust it, and then I can read it to myself and think, no, there's something not quite right with the rhythm there. I need to change this word here or this word there, and we'll progress through the paragraph, but I'll constantly be revising it as I go along because for 40 years I was working in the comics industry. And this is in serial narratives that were often monthly or weekly if we were talking about British comics. And so first drafts don't really exist in a world like that. It's just everything that you've seen of mine in the first 40 years of my career was a first draft. Because I had to train myself to produce stuff that was right the first time, which sort of I don't think has really fared me that badly. It's sort of so I do tend to polish while I'm going along, and then I will go back and polish it again when I've got to the end of the chapter. And when I get to the end of the book, in a few days' time, hopefully, I will go right back to the beginning of the book and will give it a final polish all the way through until it's exactly right. Um, so yes, it involves pointing one finger at the keyboard and then all the words pour out, but they pour out very slowly.
I'd like you to talk about how authors create worlds. And here's a clip from the book. Dennett fell to wondering, not for the first time, about Arthur Machen. He had the marvelous Welsh author heard tell or seen of the Hampole book, The Murderous Little Man, or had he somehow written both into being? But again, before he could pursue this line of thought, Grace took her feet down from the stool and sat straight up in the armchair and exhaled decisively. So, talk about just as an author how you feel when you create characters. And once again, we can go back to this Joe Meek thing because that is you doing what you describe in the book, essentially. It's pretty darn amazing, really.
Well,
You talked about your shows in the 90s as magic shows. This book is a magic show, isn't it?
yes, it is. Everything that I do is a magic show. That's what magic has become for me. When I started out working with magic, I think I needed the big spectacular stuff, just to convince myself that there was something there worth pursuing. So my early magical experiences were, conjuring demons, talking to gods, all of that sort of stuff, because that's what I needed. Doing rituals. These days, I think, more mature as a magician, and I have long since realised that there is very little difference between art and magic, and that creating any form of art, writing, music, words, pictures, everything, it is a magical act. You're bringing something out of nothing into the world where it can affect people's minds. So it's how does it feel creating these worlds and these characters? That's an interesting question. Um, when you're in the zone, when you're getting into the book, and when the characters start to take on a life of their own, which was is a cliche that I've heard writers talk about for a long time, but it does really happen. Um, the characters don't write themselves because my fingers are too tired. I know that I've been doing a lot of that. Uh, but they do tell you what they want and what they don't want. For example, in this second book, I realised quite early on that my central character, my protagonist, Dennis Knuckleyard, really doesn't want to be the main character in a fantasy novel. He resisted all of my attempts to get him into the action. It takes about two chapters before he finally allows himself to get back into the book because he really doesn't want to be there. And this is something that I realised about him during the first book. And I've realised that his love interest, Grace, she is a completely different kettle of fish. She is motivated completely differently. And this starts to shape the unfolding narrative. And there comes a point where, in describing all of these places, all of these parts of this ethereal London, describing the entities that are there and getting to know them better, there comes a point where dangerously an author, or at least this particular author, can start to think, am I channeling this from somewhere real? Or am I actually bringing this into being? And I think it might be both. That you're bringing it into being and channeling the information back through time from the thing that you're bringing into being. I don't know. Uh, it's probably just all the delusions of authors, but sort of that's certainly what it feels like. It feels like there's kind of a certain tingle, a certain energy in the writing when you know that you're on the right frequency. It's difficult to describe, but that's kind of what it's like.
You know, when my parents met, and I think after they were first married, they lived in San Jose, I think it was, or Northern California, San Carlos. And I know that before I was born, they undertook what was then a fashionable kind of vacation. They went to Las Vegas, where you could see the tests of nuclear bombs.
Uh-huh.
And they saw these nuclear bombs, and I have on occasion taken to recognize that that was the way I turned, the reason I turned out the way I did. That said, throughout the 60s and the 70s, growing up as a kid, I was terrified of nuclear war, not without reason. I mean, I'm read Failsafe and every book on nuclear war, including the scene 2001. And parts of this book remind me of 2001. Um, and we see in this book the rise of nuclear worries, and you have these great critters, the Christmas men. Uh, and I have to say that for the past maybe 20 or 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, say in the mid 80s to um, up till say 10 years ago, I didn't worry in the least bit about, or I was remained unconcerned about nuclear, uh, annihilation. Now, once again, it's up in the forefront, and it's something that you have been concerned with too. It was a theme of Watchmen, and here again, it's raising its head as a theme, and I think it's a kind of a big bad that does not go away. So I would like you to talk about the influence of, the end of the world through nuclear annihilation on your work as a
Well,
writer.
it's I think for my generation, it has been a huge thing. I know that my wife Melinda, she was growing up in San Francisco. I think she was about um, in her early teens when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and that had a massive, massive effect upon her, as it did upon everybody. I mean, interestingly, what the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was the end of 1962. I've been writing about that in the new book, because at the end of 1962, yes, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was also when Joe Meek released Telstar, just before Christmas that year. And these things sort of they have a resonance together, you know. I mean, like, but no, the nuclear thing, it never went away. It was just that people stopped talking about it or thinking about it. They weren't as focused on it as they were during the 50s with the older master marches, or during the 60s, with the constant anti-war marches that happened in the 60s. Um, but it's been there all the time. And whether on purpose or by accident, it has been a threat that could end the species. And yeah, it never went away, and so I never stopped writing about it. Um, you know, it's it's unfortunately it seems to have been one of the major themes of the century. So yes, I liked the idea of the Christmas men that don't actually do anything. They never the promised apocalypse never comes, but their presence just depresses people, makes people anxious, sort of puts a big cloud of anxiety over everybody's heads that needn't be there, because in practical terms, that is what nuclear weapons do, or at least they have done. Yes, they could do a lot worse than that, but that is what they have done to us already, just by placing this huge psychological weight upon us for the last, you, 50 or 60 years.
You talked earlier about writing about history and also referring to the present. And here I'll read another line from the book that just like set off all sorts of alarm bells in my head. Barclays Bank proudly announced that they had a computer, a new type of adding machine from the sound of it, but no one was entirely certain what it was or what it did. Well, here we are, some 60 years later, and we still have computers that we have no idea what it was or what it
Yeah,
does.
yeah, yeah. It's that this is one of the things that I'm finding in referencing the history that I'm talking about in researching it and using it. I am very aware of the fact that, uh, yeah, I'm mentioning something here that at the time wasn't a big deal. That people at the time weren't concerned about or barely noticed, but that the reader of today will think, hang on, so this is where it all started? Just with these little tiny incidents, and then here we are today. It gives the reader a sense of how things evolve and change, how situations evolve and change, to give us this very, very complicated world that we're currently experiencing. It's yeah, I like to be able when I'm over the course of these books. I mean, I'm covering uh 50 years, from 49 to 99. Um, and it's great to be able to actually take a chunk of time like that where you can see the characters growing up and getting old, where you can see all of these things that happen in real life all the time, but don't tend to happen in fantasy series, where you can see how our world, our communities, the places we live, how they have grown up and changed and evolved or deteriorated sort of with the passage of the years. It's such a big canvas, and that allows me to paint, hopefully, such a big picture.
You know, you reference the characters. God, I just love the characters in this novel all the way across the spectrum. Dennis Knuckleyard in particular, and you were talking about this earlier about how he like tries to avoid all of the terrible things he has to do. How he puts them off and finds other better things to do. And I just love that aspect about him. And so in terms of writing history, one of the things that it's easy to forget is that history has all these great big events, but at the center of it are actual human beings who experience those events, either bringing them about or being there when they happen. It's equally traumatic on either end of the, you burn me up, I'm a cigarette. Uh,
Yeah.
so so talk about creating characters to live through that great span because I am just anxious to see what happens to Dennis as he grows up. He was such a great kid and I could identify with that. Also, too, this gets to one of my pet theories about men, is that men are essentially short, like Schrodinger's cat. You put us in a box, and either we're 18 and completely gaga about everything, we're 85 and we're pretty irascible about most of it. And you never know which is gonna be inside that box when you open us up.
Well, I mean, like with uh, I'm not sure whether I experienced my life like that. I mean, I have basically, I'm an unreconstructed member of the psychedelic left from the late 1960s and early 1970s. That was when I basically formed my identity and have never really, I've seen lots of reasons to modify it since then and to expand it. But the basic core me is still pretty much the figure that I put together out of junk and stuff that was lying around back when I was 17, 18, 19. Um, and with the characters, I mean, Dennis, he emerged, as I think I mentioned in the first book in the acknowledgements, that he emerged from the edge of sleep when I was just drifting off into unconsciousness, and I'd got all of that sort of subconscious junk that tends to drift through your mind, just on the borderline of sleep. And I actually woke myself up laughing because amongst all of this random words drifting through my head was, and then Dennis Knuckleyard, and I just woke up laughing because it was the most stupid name that I'd ever heard, and yet it had a certain ring to it. I wrote it down on a piece of paper by the bedside table and thought I shall have to use that at some point, and kept it around for a couple of years until the Long London series evolved, and I thought, yes, Dennis Knuckleyard, he will be the hero. And I still didn't know who he was. And I'd originally got him. I looked back at my original proposal for the Long London books, and I've got him as quite a dynamic character. He's a young occultist, um, and as soon as I started writing the books, I thought, well, no, he's not a young occultist, is he? He's an 18-year-old. He's a mess, and he's just been through this awful period where London has been completely flattened. He's lost his parents. He's living at this bookshop with this horrible old lady. No, he's not an occultist. He's not a dynamic character. He's doing his best to survive. And that was what Dennis. That was what he was. That's what he told me he wanted to be. Um, and Grace, she kind of has evolved. In fact, in the third book, uh, because Grace is more dynamic than Dennis, he ends up letting her take the lead for a lot of the third book, which doesn't necessarily work out well for either of them, but it's certainly no worse than letting Dennis take the lead. And um, so, yeah, I mean, Dennis in the third book is perhaps more like in the role that Grace was in the second. He's involved in the action, but he's perhaps not the main player anymore because Grace is. Um, and this will change in the fourth book, which will be coming up soon. It will be very different by the end of that one. And then the fifth book, well, everybody will have to wait and see. But sort of, I've got these characters' lives roughly planned out and how they change and what happens to them, what's going to work, what isn't going to work. I know all these things, you know.
Do you know them on paper? I would just say, have you written it down, or is this quintet like a rain cloud that forms in your head and you wait for the words to rain down on the pages?
Bit of both, bit of both. I've done a little bit of preparation. Um, like I say, I wrote my initial proposal for the series, but then it was in my head. So I have to confess, I didn't really look at it after that. I've looked back at it since and thought, oh, I said I was going to do this and I haven't. I've done something completely different. Oh, well. Um, and when I'm doing each book, I will start out by typing a few pages in my jotter of, all right, this next book, you haven't really got any ideas for it, or you've got a load of half-baked ideas. What do you want from this book? What do you want it to say? What do you need? And so I'll just be talking to myself at the keyboard, and gradually the book will emerge, and then I will say, all right, can we break this down into 8 rough chapters? And so I'll do that, and it will just be a line for each chapter. And then I'll say, right, I think I'm going to start the first chapter and see what happens. And um, then so basically I'll write these notes, and then I'll never look at them again. Um, it's important that I write them because that does actually get my head into gear and shape it up. But I won't be referring to them. It's I will try to let the cloud of words accumulate and rain down, you know. So it's a bit of both, I think.
I think too, it's really important that you said you wrote them down. There's something about the physical act of writing, whether it's on a
I
keypad
agree.
or on a piece of paper, that it changes your brain immensely. And I think uh, in reverse, there's something about reading that also changes your brain immensely, that makes it an art unlike any other. Visual art and movies and the rest, they all tell you what to think. Right? Reading is a form of art where the reader performs a big part of the artwork himself.
Yes.
And I think that that is reflected when, as you said, when wrote, jot down some notes and ignore them. But they're like, signs. This, next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. It's sort of yeah. I mean, like I think that the way that I'm trying to use literature is I'm trying to use it as a drug, as a psychedelic drug that will be better than a psychedelic drug because it has a plan and it has a direction and it has a narrative. So it is not just exploding into a meaningless world of wonderful symbols, that there is actually a scheme behind it so that it will be a more meaningful experience, hopefully. But I want it to affect the reader neurologically so that they can almost see and smell and taste these worlds, that they can almost hear them, just by trying to make the prose so rich and so descriptive in its sensory nature. To be talking about the soundscape of the Great Wen and the way that real life London smells and sort of things like that. It's to put the reader neurologically there, um, and to try and make it for the reader as wonderful and as uncomfortable a situation as it is for the characters. That's my plan.
Neuroscience and neuro art meet in Alan Moore's new novel. I hear a new world coming, and you will hear a new world coming too once you sit down to read the book. Thank you for joining me, Alan.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for having me.